Israel's independence as a Jewish state was recognized by the UN on the 14th of May 1948. The day after Israel gained its independence, the major Arab powers in the area declared war on Israel, beginning the First Arab-Israeli War. Eventually, Israel won the war, preserved its independence, and achieved a national identity. In 1956, Israel once again went to war against Egypt in the Suez War in order to weaken its neighbor. While this was a success, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and other Arab powers later signed various treaties amongst themselves, and thanks to chauvinist rhetoric from both sides, Israel and her neighbors began to slide inexorably towards war. This war, known as the Six-Day War, would, despite not lasting long, change the Middle East up to this day.
Tensions between Israel and her neighbors began to increase, with Nasser's rhetoric being urged on by other Arab powers, and Israel's responses becoming more and more aggressive each time. Eventually, Israel humiliated Jordan in the Samu incident, which only added to the ever-growing tension in the area. Nasser also began inflammatory actions of his own. He expelled UN peacekeeping forces stationed in the Sinai in response to his supposed allies mocking him for hiding behind the UNEF. But the final straw that would lead to war was the closure of the Straits of Tiran, an area that was economically vital for Israeli oil shipping. Nasser had hoped that this action would appease other Arab powers and get Israel to step down. However, instead Israel responded with force. On June 5, 1967, at 7:45 a.m., Israel launched a preemptive attack on the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian Air Force. The attack on Egypt was a particularly decisive success, with some sources indicating that as much as 80% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed in a single day. This attack, known in Israel as Operation Focus, essentially guaranteed Israeli air supremacy for the rest of the war. The superiority achieved by Israeli planes allowed for successful operations to occur throughout the Sinai Peninsula, and would later help Israeli troops capture the Golan Heights from Syria. On the second day of the war, Radio Cairo released false statements of victory for the Egyptian Air Force, and even stated that Egyptian troops were in Israeli territory. The Egyptian public cheered for Nasser and declared that, "Tonight we dine in Tel Aviv." Israel, on the other hand, only released a statement that said that the war had begun in order to prevent a UN-imposed ceasefire and preventing a decisive Israeli victory. During that time, Israeli troops were defeating the Egyptian army in the Sinai thanks to undisputed air superiority. During June 7th and 8th, Israel had managed to hold on to most of Jerusalem, including the Wailing Wall, allowing Jews to pray there for the first time since 1948, and also managed to push the Egyptian army to west of the Suez Canal. During this phase of fighting in the Sinai, Israel only lost 275 soldiers, while Egyptian losses numbered to over 10,000. On June 8th, a ceasefire failed to take effect, and the belligerents continued their fighting. On the same day, the Soviet Union threatened to sever diplomatic relations with Israel if they continued to attack Syria or Egypt. Nonetheless, Israel opted to take a risk and attack Syrian positions on the Golan Heights. While Moshe Dayan, an Israeli military leader, did not want to attack Syrian positions on the Golan Heights, he was pressured by the Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, whose hometown near the Golan Heights was being shelled by Syrian troops. Moshe Dayan came up with a plan to attack the Golan Heights through a pincer movement. To their surprise, many of the areas were left abandoned, as the Syrians started to blow up bunkers and burn documents. Syria finally acknowledged the idea that it would have to accept a ceasefire, seeing that the majority of the Golan Heights were under Israeli control. By the war's end, Gaza, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights were under Israeli control.
The political fallout in Egypt was almost immediate. Due to his nation's humiliating defeat in the Six-Day War, Nasser resigned from the presidency of Egypt. He would later return as the Prime Minister of Egypt only 9 days later, but his dreams for Arab unity were destroyed for the time being. Syria's political situation was in shambles. While al-Assad was the defense minister, He effectively controlled the government through his standing in the military. There was a split in the Syrian government between al-Assad and Salah al-Jadid. Jadid blamed the military for the failures in the Six-Day War, while al-Assad blamed civilian authorities. Eventually, the two men formed their own factions and began a power struggle over control of Syria, which threatened to explode into a civil war. Eventually, Assad won this power struggle. However, the loss of the Golan Heights was strategically and politically disadvantageous for the Ba'ath Party, as Israel now occupied Syrian territory and had the high ground over Syrian border positions. Israel, on the other hand, had a relatively stable political situation. Its leaders were popular, it had tripled its landmass, and it had proven to the world, specifically to the United States, that it was strong enough to be a reliable ally in the Middle East. However, despite the support of the United States, Israel was isolated diplomatically. None of its regional neighbors recognized its sovereignty, and skirmishes between Israeli and Egyptian troops continued what is now known as the War of Attrition. Israel was also called on to withdraw from territories taken in the Six-Day War and UN Security Council Resolution 242. Israel refused to withdraw troops from those areas, which resulted in its diplomatic isolation only increasing. In order to regain the territory that had been lost, Egypt under Anwar Sadat and Syria under Hafez al-Assad, along with other Arab powers, began the Yom Kippur War.
The only goal for Egypt was to prove for a few weeks that they could fight the Israelis toe-to-toe. So the Israelis were at first shocked.
On October 6, 1973, 100,000 Egyptian soldiers began to cross the Suez Canal, meeting only token resistance from the 450 Israeli troops stationed in several forts along the border. Eventually, the Israeli soldiers were forced to withdraw, leaving behind 200 prisoners. This was a major political victory for Egypt, and it seemed as if Israel may lose all that it had gained only 6 years earlier. Egyptian fortunes were reversed when the United States chose to rearm Israel, allowing for Israeli counterattacks to begin with greater force. Eventually, the Egyptian army was pushed back and surrounded, and Israeli artillery began shelling Damascus. And on October 25, 1973, a UN-brokered ceasefire took effect, and the war was over. After the Yom Kippur War ended, ideas of peace between Israel and Egypt were appealing to both sides. In 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat visited Israel, the first time an Egyptian head of state had done so. Sadat spoke to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, about the desire for peace both countries shared. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter, urged Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat to sign the Camp David Accords in 1978. The main focus of the peace treaty was territories occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War. In this case, Israel agreed to cede the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in return for recognition as a nation. This was the first time Israel and any of its Arab neighbors had reached a compromise together. This peace process would inspire Jordan and Israel to normalize relations through a peace treaty in 1994. The political upheaval resulting from the Six-Day War truly reshaped the Middle East. While the war only lasted 6 days, the political implications that resulted would persist for years to come.
You have what is considered now one of the most intractable conflicts in the entire world, right? So, I mean, it creates what's known, the Israeli occupation of the territories, which is now the longest standing foreign occupation of any territory. It was just now half a century was the anniversary last year, so 50 years of that occupation. So you've got this conflict that is not resolved, which has led to a number of wars since then. I actually don't, a lot of people say that, it destabilizes the rest of the Middle East and so on and so forth. I think that that's greatly exaggerated. The rest of the Middle East has their own, the other countries have their own domestic dynamics, things of that nature. And while the Palestinian issue in Middle East politics is certainly used as a rallying cry for support and for the leaders of those states to get some kind of legitimacy, I don't really think it trickles down that much into those areas.
The issue with Palestine is yet to be dealt with. The Golan Heights remain under Israeli control, and Gaza is currently under an Israeli blockade. Despite this, the Six-Day War did result in one positive thing: a peace process between Israel and its neighbors. Because of the massive territorial changes and the tensions that continue to exist as a result, the Six-Day War had a profound impact on the political situation in the Middle East.